Hello, Ben. Thank you very much for joining me.
Oh,
Good to
good to
see
see
you.
you.
Good to see you. So this is the start of my Quakerology channel. I'm not sure if I've told you the title of it before, but that's what I've gone with is something that people can remember, hopefully. Um, so thank you for being one of the first interviews, really. Um, and as I told you, that the structure of this is kind of looking at your views of Quakerism as it stands in the UK today, of course, in Britain, roughly along the structure of past, present, and future. So
Hmm.
we're going to start, if you like, with can you tell us a bit about your faith journey and how come you've ended up in Quakers and how does it speak to you and meet your spiritual needs at the moment?
It's an interesting one because I started my sort of appreciation of religion and spirituality in a kind of nominally agnostic, high Anglican family who would kind of turn up at Christmas and Easter, but the rest of the time they weren't particularly bothered. And it was really the only kind of religion that I had any kind of exposure to, when I was a child. So I kind of thought, I think at the age of 6 or 7, that's broadly what religion is, that's broadly what Christianity is. But I had a very kind of restless mind and wanted to understand why people were doing things and why it mattered to them. And one of the things that really confused me as a child is that people would go along to this service and sort of sing and stand and sit. But then when you ask them like why they were doing it, they wouldn't really be able to give you any firm answers. And then when you sort of said, "Oh, do you believe this or that or the other?" People would kind of either deny that they believed anything at all, or sort of shrug, or they'd sort of say maybe. So you'd be left in this really strange situation where you had more questions than answers, really. So it kind of left me with a very mixed feeling about ceremony, about ritual, about why people were doing particular things. But then when I was a teenager, about the age of sort of 13, 14, 15, like lots of teenagers, I guess, I was really fascinated by various things in school about the big so-called world religions, Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, and being able to compare them and started to see, how beliefs varied and practices varied. And I started going on a bit of a spiritual odyssey where I explored lots of different spiritual terrains and practices, and it was a wonderful time, really, of exploration. And I got to university, and I sort of came back to Christianity in quite a liberal, ambiguous, ill-defined form. Um, but I didn't really know what to do with that, and it took me many years to work out what it all really meant. And it all started because I was doing a module at the time as part of my degree, and it was called the Religious Mapping of Leeds. And as part of that module, we were encouraged to go along to a religious community or a church that we'd never had any prior experience of. So I turned up opposite the engineering building at a Quaker meeting house on Woodhouse Lane, which we're both familiar. And so I turned up at a Quaker meeting, had a few experiences of sitting for an hour in silence, and I would ask questions to people at the end. And it was interesting because in some ways that experience of kind of woolly Anglicanism was replicated, where I had loads of questions as well, but not as many answers as I quite liked. But that was good in a way because after the project ended, I kept on coming back to meetings. So I hadn't got a kind of professional reason to be there, but I was drawn by the silence. And a few months later, after kind of going fairly regularly, I had some very powerful experiences of it's hard to put words around, but a sense of love, a sense of being held, a sense of divine presence. And I think at that time, I wasn't had very mixed feelings about the Christianity of my childhood, really. So I think when I was at that point, so this must have been in about 2005 or 6, I think you probably would have placed me as a kind of liberal Universalist Quakers. So I would have a kind of dusting of Christian language, but broadly I would sort of say all the kind of religious particulars don't really matter, and all roads lead broadly to the same place in a kind of woolly world religion sort of way. Um, but it was only later, really, that something really peculiar happened for me in meeting. And that was that for a very, very long time, my sort of use of Christian language and imagery had been a sort of subconscious part of my mental furniture. It was a bit like a pond had been sort of frozen over. But then all of a sudden, the pond started unfreezing and water started gushing out. And my ministry changed, and I began to have a real appreciation again for biblical stories, biblical narrative, my own understanding, and lots of childhood memories of that language and that experience sort of came back to me all of a sudden. So I'm in this odd sort of situation, I think, really, where I began my Quaker journey as a sort of ex-Anglican liberal Universalist. And I sort of sit with you now, really, as someone who has reappropriated, revitalized, re-energized a certain understanding of Quaker Christianity. So it's been an interesting journey in that way.
So you describe yourself as a Christian Quaker now, would you?
Yes, definitely.
So, so can you tell us a bit about your current spiritual practice then? Because I mean, I know of you as somebody who is very deeply spiritually grounded because I mean, I love your ministry and it's I really do miss your ministry. So there's obviously a deep grounding there, and as you say, you're using biblical stories more and more. So, what would you say is your weekly or daily spiritual practice?
It's interesting because I think I do pray much more than I used to, and I think my prayer is not really a kind of routine or mechanical process, but it's simply just particularly sort of mornings and evenings, having time to commune with the spirit, maybe reflect on a particular image or story, maybe just sort of centering down and just focusing on my breath for a little while, and then see what images or words bubble up. So almost like meeting for worship, just by oneself, really. And I think the other thing that really has impacted me and my understanding of sort of spiritual practice has just been finding um, the divine in the ordinary experience of life. So literally just walking out your front door and appreciating, the sky or flowers or shrubs, just something that can keep you grounded. And that kind of seasonal element has also been something that's mattered to me more and more as I've explored or re-explored this Christian terrain. Because one of the interesting influences on me when I was a teenager was modern Druidry. Now, modern Druidry is a really interesting hodgepodge of traditions, but one of the things that it sort of left me with, I think, which I've also recovered at about the same time, is this idea that the earth and the ordinary seasons, the ordinary rhythms of the world are a possibility for connection and divine human encounter. So that's kind of left a big, a bit, cast a big shadow, I think, over my sense of spiritual practice, which is very hodgepodge and very sort of spontaneous, and it doesn't always have a pattern to it, but it's definitely got a shared intention, which is about trying to find the eternal in the present. That matters hugely to me, I think.
And of course, this is the spaciousness that Quaker meeting allows, isn't it? I mean, it allows each of us to take a different path. How how have you experienced Quaker meeting then over this, 10, 15 years or 20 years or so that you've been involved? What, how does your Christian centered approach rub up against other people's approaches? As you say, there's Buddhists and all sorts amongst us.
Mm. it's interesting because I think there's two versions of that story. So one is a kind of generous, creative hospitality. So you're meeting people with lots of different perspectives, and you're actually learning a huge amount. And you're deepening your understanding of the world by having these wonderful stories. So a lot of the kind of Quakers that I'm very, very close to, interestingly, are Buddhist members of our meeting who bring with them a huge respect for contemplation, and I think that's incredibly valuable. So if you think about, say, Zen traditions, which is about being in the present moment, and the Buddha is in the present moment, and you don't have to go on a big journey to find capital R reality because it's already there. It's I think the famous Zen image is you're polishing a mirror, aren't you, and you see your reflection, and it's, yeah, the truth is already there. You just need to uncover it. So I find that an incredibly positive experience because you're always being challenged. People are always offering their gifts to you, and I think that's been a beautiful experience. And I think that's one part of a kind of broader Quaker liberal universalism that I've never left behind. The idea, actually, that divine wisdom comes in many forms, and so you shouldn't spend your time saying, "Oh, well, you can't be a vessel of divine wisdom because you don't conform to my expectations." So I always take the view of a kind of open generosity, that people will come and you'll have unexpected encounters, and that is incredibly powerful. And I think part of the way I think we know that we're a spirit-led community is that unexpected people, or people that don't fit your expectations, people that may be a little bit on the edge of things, turn up and make a big impact on our gathered worship. So that's the kind of positive spin on it. But there's a kind of negative aspect to it as well, which I've come up against. And I think that is that we often in Friends talk about being, inclusive. And there's a significant resistance, I think, among a lot of Friends to any kind of boundary, whether it's a kind of boundary around belief or who should be a friend or who shouldn't be a friend. And the model of inclusion, I think, is very, it's very, very diffuse. And I think there's kind of a problem there. And the problem that I see is that we want to include people, but we're not really very clear about what we're including people in. And I think that does two things. One, I think it means that when people come to Friends, they sort of end up having to fill in the gaps themselves about what they think it means and what's going on. Or they sort of think that they have to invest the space with their meaning because there's no meaning, already there. So I suppose an example of that would be, such a friend might think of silence as negation, as like an open space, as like a blank piece of paper on which they can just write whatever feels right to them. And in that model, I suppose, Quakerism becomes a kind of therapy, a kind of semi-private therapeutic exercise. And I think there's a problem there because it sort of misses out the fact that actually Quakerism is a tradition. We have language about God, we have history, we have story, we have practices that are rooted in a particular understanding of, God, community, and life. And by making Quakerism a kind of empty canvas on which we invite people to, sketch their own pictures, we lose that sense, I think, of wanting to include people in something that isn't just private and individual, but something that's shared. And I think it's the inability we have of sharing our Quakerism, being brave enough to share it with each other. So not just about outreach, but kind of inreach, where we sort of say, can we explain what we're doing and what we love and what we care about to each other in a way that helps us to come together as a spiritual community. So that openness is magical because you can have those wonderful encounters. But the downside, I think, of I suppose what some scholars have called liberal Quakerism or hyper-liberal Quakerism, is you lose the capacity to tell a shared story about what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I think I don't know if the term entryism here is relevant. Is in that negative version for a moment that you've just talked about and the dangers of to us as a community of people who see it as this blank slate into which they can, put their own agenda, really. Do you feel that there's um, are we taken advantage of as a community in some respects because we are so open, and that boundary is very permeable. The rules are not particularly clear, um, and because of we're such a well-meaning and inclusive lot generally, is there is there a danger of entryism? And what I mean by that, obviously, is people thinking, well, I can forward my agenda within this community because this community is not clearly boundaried. So I can come in and I can change what Quakers is all about. I can use it as a vessel for my own ends. Do you see that at all?
I have observed that on a couple of occasions where I think elders have not been able to articulate clearly enough to a newcomer the things that matter to us, and partly because the elders may be a little bit uncertain about how to say what matters to them to the
Mm,
newcomer. So there's a weird kind of tentativeness, and actually that has caused a lot of distress because the newcomer didn't know what the norms were. Nobody explained it to them, and so it all ended horribly. I won't go into like the particular case, but it wasn't a good experience, and it,
yeah.
it it illustrated to me the inability of a lot of friends in more liberal parts of Quakerism, like say in Britain and parts of Canada and the US, to have a kind of teaching ministry where we explore together the stories and practices and the rationale for why we are together on this journey. But I think there's kind of another side to your entryism point, and that's a kind of positive way of framing the same problem, which is that we have a lot of spiritual refugees in our
Mm,
meetings. So we
mm,
have a lot of people who have had a really negative experience of, for want of a better phrase, organized religion or a particular kind of traditional authoritarian experience of religion. And so actually, because you've got a lot of people that feel very wounded and very reticent and maybe carry a lot of very deep baggage with them, when you sort of say, "Oh, but there's this deep spiritual tradition, and we're all part of it," they go, "Oh, you're trying to induct me back into that horrible thing for which I
mm.
escaped." So I think one of the reasons why we end up in this quite unsatisfactory inclusiveness that doesn't invite you into anything definite is we sort of, because there is that woundedness, we're not able to say to people, actually, okay, you had very negative experiences about God, but have you considered that Quakers have a completely different idea about God and ideas about, divine love or divine intervention or whatever it might be? I had a conversation with a friend a little while ago because there was a discussion at our meeting about um, changing the Quaker marriage vows and removing God from the vows. And so I went along and we had a discussion about this. And one friend said, "I think it's really important that we, take away the language of God because it's awful. Because God is patriarchal and misogynist and homophobic and is yeah." So, but actually, what this friend was saying, and I was listening very carefully, it was all about their woundedness. But actually, a response to that is not to go, "Well, you're very wounded by this language, so we better chuck it all out because you're
Mm.
very wounded." I think a better response is to go, "Now, you're very wounded by this experience, but Quakers have different things to say about this word. It means something quite different in a Quaker context. We have different stories and different symbols and different ways of
Yeah.
thinking about this." And I think that there is a desire among some friends to go, "These friends are very wounded, so we better take out anything that might be upsetting or challenging." Um, and I worry that you're sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater there.
Yeah, and you're making me think here about kind of this term safe space, which I have some issues with, which has become everywhere nowadays. This idea of we mustn't we mustn't hurt anyone at any in any way. We mustn't be challenging in any way. And it just doesn't sit well with me, really. And I think that's perhaps how I would describe what you've just said, is that we become such a soft space. It's like that marshmallow, no, it wasn't marshmallow advert. Was it the soft mints advert, where everything's fluffy and everything's quilted and soft. And there's no hard edges, if you like. I suppose I have these views about moral formation and character formation, that you need to bump up against things which are hard and difficult and challenging, and you need to be pushed back against. And if you do try to challenge boundaries or behaviors, it's important that elders and others are there to kind of contain that in some way and push back against that way. Otherwise, you end up with, I mean, I don't know, what do you end up with? I mean, I think we have some real dangers within Quakers in Britain at the moment around safe space. That is it too safe a space, broadly speaking, and that people come and go without us really having taught them. Do you worry about that, or do you think we get the balance right?
It's a difficult one because I think I kind of want to push against the kind of language of safe space in a slightly different way. I think if you don't give people boundaries and anchor points, spaces become profoundly unsafe
Mm,
while on the surface appearing to be inclusive. So it was kind of going back to my example of this friend who didn't know what anything was about, and so acted out in a very, very difficult way for the elders. Then the elders didn't know what to do because they didn't have
mm,
boundaries
mm,
and settled places to return to and
mm.
anchor points. So in a sense, I suppose I'm kind of wanting to say that actually, paradoxically, the safest spaces are bounded ones where we have shared anchor points and shared points of connection. I mean, I think a good example of this in everyday life is there are lots of people who are very sort of alienated from formal rituals or religion or shared cultures, but there are the sort of emergency services moments in your life where you need a model or a structure in which to operate. So a good example of that is when people are grieving and around funeral rites, the idea of somebody having to invent what to do at a point of crisis from themselves is a terrible burden to put on someone. So actually what you want to do in those points of disconnection and trauma is to go, don't worry, there's a format for a funeral, we know what to do, and so knows what to do, and there's a particular way in which we do this.
Yeah.
But I kind of think we do this in Quakers in a broader way. We go, okay, there are these big issues about God, life, the universe, everything. Off you go. You can just have a wander. If you get lost, sorry. I kind of feel that's not helpful because that does cause disconnection and confusion, and also makes the community very diffuse. And again, it's hard to share things together.
Yeah, and of course it makes the individual feel awful, doesn't it? I mean, I do think that some people end up leaving Quakers because they feel, oh, I'm not good enough, I haven't done it right, I didn't know what I was doing. Or, as you say, make some terrible faux pas and kind of say things they shouldn't have said, or acted like it was an AA meeting or something, and another group that they've been part of, and suddenly they feel horrified and just emotionally exposed, really. And I just think, yes, it's a much kinder thing is to give clear boundaries and give clear teaching along the way. And I just don't think we get that right sometimes. Um, I mean, I was telling you a little bit about the Future of Quakerism conference, which I went to. Did you listen into that at all? I don't know if you were there
No, I wasn't. I wasn't there at the time, and I only just heard bits and bobs from different people. That yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, there's about 200 people there, and it was blended, so there was people online as well. And we had many of these conversations, and it was on the drive home that I thought, I really wish I could listen to some of these kinds of ideas. And I listened to these long form interviews myself, which is what gave me this idea, you see. But one of the things that happened at that conference, which I think was so interesting as a kind of a symbol and just a manifestation of this issue is that there was a young mother and a toddler there who's about 2 years old, and he was delightful young man. He was very playful, but of course, as the weekend went on and as the sessions went on, he was in the main sessions and wasn't really given much guidance as to how to be.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is there was elements of him running around the space and going up to the main speaker. So he went up at one point to Ben Pink Dandelion and had a whole conversation with him when Ben's there on the microphone, And he was kind of, running around being a little bit vocal sometimes and throwing his toys around and I part of me does think, well, isn't that wonderful that children can engage? But there's some kinds of more helpful boundaries, I think, that could have been provided there.
Mm.
And I was sat there at the back of the room thinking, now I'm an active person, I tend to just stand up and just get on and deal with stuff. And I thought, well, I'm going to take an observation role here because it is often me that does something here. And I thought, the people sat around this mother and child, they didn't do anything. The elders didn't say anything or do anything. There were loads of staff there, didn't do anything. And I just think there's an opportunity really that was lost there
Mm.
about how to model what does safe space look like, what does community look like. And I suppose my view is that it takes a village to raise a child, and similarly for each one of us. I mean, you described yourself as a new youngish man joining Quakers for the first time. It takes a village to raise you as a committed community member as well. And I just wish that we weren't quite so passive. I mean, we're pacifist, but I worry sometimes that we're also passive. Um, yeah, I mean, have you got any reflections on that as an example?
Well, again, it comes back to your thing about what is safety, and it's not actually kind to anyone to leave them without boundaries and anchor points because they won't get the most out of the community. I mean, I had a conversation with another friend in an online committee recently, and they were just pouring scorn on Quaker disciplines of business meeting for worship and processes. And they said, "Oh, I don't understand why we do any of these things. I mean, we know what we're doing, don't we? And so, we just let the spirit in us speak, and we just go off and do it. And I don't know why we have all these stupid committees and all these stupid processes of say." And that's an extreme view, but it comes from the same place of wanting to include and not wanting to and stripping everything
Mm.
back and right back down. And I said, well, the thing is, you're confusing, rules with, hollow or oppressive devices. Whereas actually, if you think of rules in a positive way, so I said, take an example. If you want to play cricket, you have to abide by the rules of cricket. If we started just removing the rules of cricket, eventually there'd be no game at all because everyone would just be running in different directions and doing different things. So the rules are not designed to oppress anyone. They're not designed to diminish the individual. They're not designed to force the individual into a mold. But if you want to do a particular activity, you have to have shared rules in which to do the activity. And that's the other thing. There's a difference between kind of oppressive discipline and knowing the knack of something. So there's a difference between a horrible sort of tiger parent, forcing their child to learn piano, and that horrible motive to the joy that they get from actually just wanting to learn piano and becoming quite good at it. It's I mean, you talked
Mm.
about character, but I think you can also talk about with character, you talk about practice. So you practice character. That's formation comes by doing lots of things again and again together, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And it speaks to something that I've thought for many years. I know about maybe 5 years after I first started coming to Quakers. I mean, much around the same time as you, I suppose. Um, and I remember, the first I coincidentally arrived for the first time when Quaker Quest was happening a lot.
Mm,
And you remember that Leeds kind of almost exhausted themselves doing it, trying to copy the London model by doing so many Quaker Quests every week. But I benefited from that.
mm,
And I had 6 months of my first 6 months attendance being able to go to a Quaker Quest session, discussing and hearing speakers every Wednesday evening. But what I was struck by was that 5 years on,
mm,
where perhaps I'd moved away from a kind of a non-theist position, I'd moved away from a kind of a universalist position, and I was thinking, how do I go deeper here?
mm,
And I've just found that we don't really have good structures in Quakers in Britain at the moment to help that deepening of individuals and of communities. Now, I don't want to, dismiss what Woodbrook do because, they obviously do provide a service, but there's something lacking in, I think, perhaps our culture that we don't value these things, and
mm.
we somehow try to make sure that anybody with spiritual ideas just know their place and just don't get too above their station. Um, and maybe I'm overstating it, but what do you think about that? That the kind of the spiritual formation of members of our community, maybe 3 or 4, 5 years in, when they've kind of really settled and they've got over that woundedness, perhaps, and
Mm.
they've found a spiritual home. What then? What do we do that well enough at the moment?
I think, I mean, obviously different meetings do different things, but I think it's very patchy. I think what happens is people are left to their own devices and not given steer, and almost that they have to pick Quakerism up through osmosis, which is, I think, really unsatisfactory. And so, for those of us who feel that we're very bossy and articulate people and we can go off and find things, that's okay, but that's not for everyone. And there is also this tendency that you often get where you'll say to an elder, "I'd like to learn a bit more about this," and they'll just give you like a book list.
Yes.
And you're like, that's not enough because you have to be able to have spaces in which to explore in a deep, prayerful way. I mean, in my meeting at the moment, we're having a sort of argy-bargy about whether to have afterword or not. Now, afterword, of course, goes through cycles. So some people think afterword is a really good thing. Some people say, "Oh, why do you have afterword? Because if you thought it was worth saying, you should have said it in the main meeting for worship." But the other thing that we've done as well is the idea that we don't have afterword most weeks now, but there's a corner in which people can talk about what they heard. Now, I don't know how I feel about this corner because I feel like this corner is a version of your thing about spiritual things get hived off. So people can do important stuff like talk about committees, the rest of it. Then there's like this little corner where we can talk about weird things that we experience in worship
Yeah.
rather than integrating it into our everyday experience. And I think there is something in our culture. People are very eager to move on, I notice, from what they've heard in worship sometimes. So if
Yeah.
you have very deep ministry, I notice there's a weird sort of switch that goes on in people's heads and they quickly talk to you about anything else than what
Mm.
they just experience. And I think that's a problem
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. Um, I mean, sometimes, a meeting is so profound and so centered, and you reach such a deep place. It actually takes me some time to come out of that. Um, and I like Afterward for that reason because it kind of provides a buffer zone to
Mm,
help you come out of it. Um, but it does strike me that generally people want to get into the social aspect or just simply scuttle off, as I call it, and they just disappear out the door. Whereas I think that's why we have deep conversations, is because the silence is holding it. Once you remove the silence
mm,
as the holding space, then people's social anxieties come to the fore and they want to chatter then, they want to fill the space and they want to, let's not get into this deep stuff. And we just, for some reason, we just don't seem able to do that and hold that space. So you end up with literally 1 hour of it, maybe another 10 minutes of afterward if you wish. And I do worry that we don't then provide that deepening. I mean, one of the things that I've been exploring myself is thinking through how we lengthen and deepen the experience for the whole community. And one of the things I was experimenting as a thought experiment is, if let's just say meetings became 10 a.m. to 12,
mm,
so that anybody who really likes as it is, just carry on turning up to usual time and just join us and it won't matter. But at 10 o'clock, some form of programmed stuff will happen. Now that might be reading, might be discussion, it might be um, something creative or singing. It might be there's all sorts of things it could be.
mm.
But that then it would just move seamlessly into a meeting, but that there's something that is a shared experience beforehand that structures the experience for people. And in terms of inclusion, we hear that some people find it very difficult to structure their own completely unprogrammed
Yeah.
hour and they have to knit and things like that. So I just think that that's where my solution focused personality, I suppose, that's where I am at the moment in terms of what I think we should be experimenting with. And then top it off with afterward and perhaps a corner. But so it becomes a more a fuller, deeper experience for people on a Sunday.
I mean, there are some, conservative Quaker communities in the US that do something similar to this. So some
Mm.
meetings I've heard about, what they do is they have Bible study quite early before meeting for worship. So people have had 45 minutes of reflecting on a text or an image or a story. Then they go into meeting feeling centered. So rather than having to spend 20 minutes like having to center themselves and then go, oh no, I'm not doing this right, and all the social anxiety that might engender. They've already had sort of 45 minutes of quite supportive, reflective space in which they are already held in a prayerful mode. And this is really useful, I think, because it allows you to slowly enter that deep place without feeling like, oh no, like the elders, like they've sat down, so I need to be in the right space. So it's another version of your bridging idea. So you're bridging people into worship, and then through afterward, you're bridging people out again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 exactly. Because I think, if we come back to this inclusion idea of, not everybody is confident enough and robust enough in their own experience of life and character, if you like, that they just need a little bit more guidance and they're a bit too nervous, if you like, to come into a completely unstructured environment. Um, I mean, coming back to the inclusion thing then, we just talked about being so woolly that we welcome everyone to the point where we're perhaps not inclusive anymore. I mean, there's some talk at the moment, isn't there, that we are racist as a society because Quakers in Britain are largely white.
Mm.
Now, I have huge issues with this as a concept, but what do you make of that? Do you think we are, worryingly excluding people somehow?
Not intentionally. I think where this critique comes from, I think, is a sense of you have a group of people who may kind of be broadly from the same socioeconomic background as well, that may be from a certain kind of white British extraction, that might have a certain kind of articulacy, maybe a certain kind of public sector vibe.
Mm,
There are
mm,
lots of these elements. I mean, I remember I was in I was having a chat with some friends, and we're talking about the themes of truth and integrity. And friends are very worried about their ability to work across political and social boundaries. And I said to a group of friends, "So how many of you in the room are regular readers of The Guardian?" And like all these hands just went. So I think there is a certain kind of monoculture which has arisen with British Quakers maybe over the last sort of 50,
mm,
60 years,
mm,
which maybe wasn't the case in the previous century when it was a little bit more diverse. I mean, yes, there's always been the kind of business owner contingent and sort of politician contingent of the Society of Friends, but I think there is always a danger of monoculture, and ethnicity might be part of that, I think. So I wouldn't want to kind of just fixate on ethnicity as like the only sort of way in
mm.
which we might exclude people. But I think there's also issues of class as well and background too.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think a monoculture is a fair criticism. I mean, I can't see how anybody would disagree with that. And I think your point about, how many people read The Guardian, it's more what worries me is not that you read The Guardian, but is that the only source of information and news that you have about the world? One of the things that really changed me was around the Brexit vote.
Mm,
And I was visiting a meeting, and there was all this, ministry about how terrible Brexit had been. And then in Afterward, someone stood up and said, "Well, I'm a Brexit voter and I'm very happy with my decision. And how do you think you've all made me feel? And I don't feel welcome here anymore." And you can imagine,
mm,
um, and you can extrapolate that out to lots of different issues. Um, I mean, I eat meat.
mm,
I support British farmers.
mm,
Now, there are certain things which have become,
mm,
it's almost like as a part of the culture of Quakers is to have a particular viewpoints,
mm,
this range of viewpoints that you're allowed to have. And I just think that is the most worrying aspect of this. I don't think we are keeping people out and not welcoming people,
mm.
but that actually, if they read about us and look at what we do, they think, "Oh no, that's not for me. Thank you very much."
Well, that's it. That's interesting because I think, does that bring us back to this broader thing about kind of woolliness or spiritual impoverishment? So people are more definite about secular political issues.
Yes.
They are about like the ultimate things that draw them
Yeah.
together as a community. So I think my worry would be, I mean, so we've recently changed the name of our outreach committee to our Faith in Action committee, which has
Right.
changed the tone, I think, of what we sort of do. And at some point, I will turn up to one of the talks, I think, and I'll make this point and maybe just make it once and then just see what people do. Um, Before you act, in a way that's faithful, you have to reflect about what is the thing that you're trusting in.
Yes.
Where is the trust coming from, the faithfulness? And we're very quick, I think, to dive into many important political causes, many of them right and worthy and appropriate. But we spend too long diving into a political posture rather than spending a little bit of time before we can crystallize that into an action, thinking, okay, what is the
Mm.
ultimate love and truth and goodness that is guiding me towards this posture? So we're in this funny situation where, we've got stronger opinions about, the two-child benefit cap than we have about, where do we think the world comes from and how do we fit into this world, and are we loved, and where is the world going and what does it all mean? We've almost put those things into a private box, it's optional. You can just believe what you want about those things. But when it comes to political issues about how you act in the world,
Yeah,
about public practice, we become very certain of
yeah,
ourselves. And I
yeah.
find that interesting.
I think that's such a good point, Ben. Um, and therefore, well, these kinds of interviews I've been doing, I have insisted that all of these start with what is your faith journey? What's your spiritual practice? So we get a sense of who people are spiritually before we hear their viewpoints on stuff, because some people, quite honestly, are very able and willing to have very definite opinions on social issues and political issues, but they can't demonstrate where, as you've just put it, where the trust in that comes from. Which I just think is fascinating. So I'm really glad that well, I feel like these ideas for this interview just kind of landed fully formed in my head, which is how these things are given, I think, sometimes. Um, because maybe we shouldn't be listening so much to people and discernments until we're really convinced about where they came from. Because I just think some of the things that Quakers in Britain are getting themselves into start to stray off. And I suppose what worries me is what I've started to call a performative piety.
Mm.
That people will speak in very hushed tones, and they might insist on beginning a meeting with some quiet, which is great. But that is in itself, they think that's enough then. If
Mm.
we have some quiet and we talk in hushed tones, that means we're proven to ourselves and everybody in the group that we're coming from a deep place. And I'm, you know, that's a very cynical thing to say, perhaps, but it's occurred to me a number of times um, that we're not confidently challenging people to say, well, talk to me about the spiritual basis of the political point you're making there. You
Mm.
know?
Mm. I mean, some of it I think is about, we are sponges. We all are, right? So I live out in the world. We all get exposed to media messages, political messages, and so on, and we carry a lot of the stuff inside us. But what makes it, I think, more difficult, of course, is we have an entire industry called the media where opinions are sold to us. They're not opinions we have formed. They're opinions we're encouraged to adopt.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah,
which isn't to say that we can't have profound political convictions, but it's much easier, I think, to shop for your opinions and to go, yes, well, I'm in this tribe, so I must have these opinions because this makes me a good member of the tribe. Human beings care a lot more about being sociable than being true quite often, and this is a problem that I think we all have.
yeah,
But I think that the challenge maybe is, this is about discernment. What is the difference between the sort of arid winds of the world, where it's like lots of anger and crossness and contradiction, and what is the deep place of centeredness from which we come. I mean, I think part of the problem is that I always think of somebody like John Woolman, who is a wonderful character in lots of ways. And one of the reasons he's so amazing is he combined contemplation with social action. So there are lots of friends who you can kind of divide them, I think, between contemplatives, and I'm probably more on this side, and sort of barricade friends who want to go out and tie themselves to things and protest. Um, but actually, what we want to do, I think, as Quakers, is not divide these two postures, because actually, what we need to do is bring them back together again. So Woolman would have always said that his action around, slavery, and his kind of revulsion against cruelty to animals and so on, that emerged from prayer. So for him, religious life was like breathing. So he'd sort of go in
Mm.
you go inwards, he'd be changed by the experience of going inwards, and then he was able to go outwards into the world in a different way. And I think we sort of go, oh, I haven't got time for all this going inwards crap. We need to do something now. We need to, we need to overturn this or deal with that. But actually, that's not, I think, the right way of doing it. There's no wasted time in
No.
prayer. There's no wasted time in contemplation. And I think we are losing the capacity to see the value in the going inward process.
Mm.
So for me, that's the biggest problem, that we've cut off the activism from the inwardness.
And you see, I wonder whether we've gone too far in that activism, because once you start to, well, if we have cut it off, like you've just said, um, we need to pull back our political activism and regroup and really become more deeply immersed in this inward life.
Yeah.
Because I think some of our positions are too firmly held, as you've described. And then we've become so kind of nailed our colours to the mast, if you like, of saying this is who we are, this is what we believe, this is the tribal position, this is the range of viewpoints, that you pick a Quaker out and you can tell what their viewpoints are. I just think that's a terrible position for us to be in. And what really bothers me, which I find dishonest, is that we claim to want more diversity.
Mm.
There's a lot of talk about we want more diversity. And I just find that really quite a hypocritical position to
Mm.
take, because I don't genuinely see that that's what we do. If we genuinely wanted diversity, we would be very cautious about putting out statements about what we believe in terms of political activism.
Mm.
We'd be very cautious about that, because you wouldn't want to put off somebody who has
Mm.
very, honorably arrived at a completely different conclusion.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm aghast really at some of the things that Quakers in Britain say for us, for example, on our behalf.
Mm.
And I think, well, hold on a second. Are you sure about that? And furthermore, I think something, when speaking to somebody else the other day, the yearly meeting minutes, for example, which I love. I mean, I love the yearly meeting process. I love that experience of being, 1,000 people together discerning a big issue. I love that. And the minutes generally are great. But I was really quite struck this year just gone in 2024, that one of the discussions was, what have we done about those minutes? And I suppose I think worse and worse of that now as the months go by, because I think it's almost taking these minutes as creeds,
Mm.
as creedal statements that, this is what we believe, and prove yourself, if you like.
Mm.
And the more I think about that, I think it's the wrong way to go, and we shouldn't be doing that.
So I
Um,
suppose my sort of feeling about this is interesting, because there's nothing wrong about desiring diversity, particularly if it's about affirming the kind of wonderfulness of the human family, and it's about hospitality, and
yeah,
it's about welcome, right?
yeah.
And that's where it comes from, a desire to give and to share. If, however, diversity is about making ourselves feel good, about feeling virtuous, about a kind of, it's an egotistical action of
Yeah.
going, we have morally perfected ourselves because we have ejected from ourselves all these perceived exclusions and limitations. Then it's not really about the other. It's not really about welcome or hospitality. It's about a community worried about itself. And I think there's a lot of sort of breastbeating among Quakers about that, which actually appears to be very sort of loving and other focused, but really is entirely egotistical. It's entirely focused on self.
And that's what I really mean about performative piety. It's another thing, really, that's an example of that. It's like, look at how good I am because I've got these acceptable viewpoints for 2024, Um, uh, What do you make then of the current, well, the fact that we've just had Trump elected, and I mean, I don't really want to get into American politics per se, but I do think there's a kind of a shift is happening,
Mm.
and I sense it in this country as well. What do you make of that? I mean, do you think there are ramifications? Do you think there is a kind of a shift going on? The very fact that I've started this channel and here we are talking about all of these issues. Do you get a sense that there's something in the air shifting?
Perhaps. I mean, I can't work out whether it's sort of just a temporary thing or whether it speaks to something more profound. But I think, we're going through enormous social and economic changes in the West. I mean, there was a commentator a few uh, days ago who sort of spoke about the end of Pax Americana, the long European American sponsored economic model and economic peace that we've experienced broadly since 1945. I know that Europe has exported a lot of its wars, so part of our peace has been artificial. But we've sort of reached the point where the old models that we created in the post-war world are beginning to start, they're beginning to unravel, I think, because there are new social and economic forces, rise of America, rise of China, and so on. And not that we want to get into like the
No,
complete
let's not.
economic changes, but I think these big changes are having existential effects on politics. They're making us maybe more fearful. I think they're creating, maybe not creating, but they're amplifying xenophobia. They're kind of amplifying divisions. And of course, the other broad bit of context is we have a social media interconnected world. But of course, the algorithm is not based on what's helpful, but what produces engagement. And rage is very good for producing engagement, isn't it? Fear and rage are these two
Mm,
impulses. So I think it kind of offers us a really big challenge, but it's not the same challenge as we've got to have the right political beliefs. It's actually much more profound than that, which is how do we nurture, love and generosity in a social and political environment where the default setting is hostility, rage, and suspicion. To me, that feels like a much bigger job than, what do you think about safe spaces or the two-child benefit cap or reparations? To me, this feels much bigger, which is about how do you build connections between people? How do you build trust? How do you encourage forgiveness and solidarity? So these, to me, are they feel nebulous, but at the same time, they're sort of everywhere. You can sort of see
mm.
them operating, can't you, underneath a lot of our conversations.
And I think that is what Quaker meetings and Quaker community, wherever it is, does very well, and probably all religious communities do. But I think it's why religious communities and Quakers, as an example of that, are all about, in the end, relationships and connection and helping us each become, more fully full expressions of humanity, if you like. And I think we do those things well. And I mean, we're not filled with fear and rage today, are we? And I mean, none of these conversations are about fear and rage. So I don't think that that's something that's particularly something that we need to correct or respond to. You see, one of the things that worries me is what I call censorship. And I think within society at the moment, we are seeing censorship. And I
Mm,
think, if somebody said to me, why have you started this channel or these interviews? And it's partly because I don't feel that there is open conversations about these things
mm,
beyond just personal, private conversations. So I believe that there are staff mainly, but kind of, the editorship of, for example, of The Friend, the moderation of the Facebook pages run by Quakers in Britain's staff.
Mm.
There's gatekeepers. I mean, again, one of my other interviews mentioned the other day, they're gatekeeping it. And that's what worries me, that this, I take your point that these external forces that are about fear and rage and hostility and anti-immigration or whatever,
Mm.
but then the response of that has been
Yes.
censorship.
Yes.
And I just think is just wrong. I think it's just fundamentally wrong, and it's heading us down a very insular path.
Well, I think one response maybe to a kind of climate of rage and fear is to kind of have a very definite, almost binary response. So we have a particular set of, say, political answers to a complicated issue. I mean, I was kind of very struck, since we're going into controversial issues, I was reflecting on reparations and how I felt about the language around reparations.
Mm.
I think one of the reasons why we're getting ourselves in a real tangle about what to do is that we're not able to talk about moral complexity. So,
Mm.
sort of example that sort of rested on me for quite a while was, imagine that there's a guy of Afro-Caribbean descent who's been brought up in London, and part of his experience for maybe 30 years is, police profiling and his experience of racial prejudice, which is a broader legacy of the fact that his ancestors were enslaved and dispossessed and brought to these shores. So then, in that narrative around reparations, you say, oh, well, we've got a very clear target about who to help and how to help them. I mean, apart from the problem of, again, white savior complex, where we go, oh, yes, well, we have the solution to your problems. Don't worry, like what white people are awful, but we're
Yeah.
still in charge. Like we're still going to fix your problems, which I think is kind of ironic. I think, but the other issue I think is around the fact that, okay, this guy lives in London. He lives in one of the most prosperous cities on earth that benefited from slavery. So what do you do
Yeah.
then? So you have to acknowledge that he is both
Yeah.
complicit and a beneficiary of the same institutions that enslaved and dispossessed his ancestors, and the same institutions that are still disadvantaged, putting him in a place of disadvantage now.
Yeah.
And I think the issue is we are very keen to go, right, the world is about oppressors and oppressed, but actually it's more complicated than that. And we have to, I think, have a much more complex moral discussion about that. I mean, I was thinking the same thing around Extinction Rebellion, because kind of a big thing in XR is, well, it's all the big companies that burn all this gas and are destroying the forests. But actually, it's the millions of consumers who want these products as well. Like, so it's not just about rich people making enormous profits. We're all complicit in a system, and I think there is a danger that we want to be pure. So we always say, we're pure, and this other group are impure.
Mm.
So we end up in a very, I think, often destructive set of political conversations that can't really deal with moral complexity. And I would I would kind of go a bit theological, really, at this point. And I want to talk about sin. Quakers don't like to
Yeah.
talk about sin.
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
Let's do.
you
Yeah.
know, traditional models of sin say, that we're all sin, we're all in sin, right? We're all mutually wounded. I'm wounded, you're wounded, we're all wounded together. But that is an incredibly freeing insight.
Mm.
It's not a repressive insight. It's actually freeing, because it says, I am as wounded as you are. So if we're all wounded together, how do we heal each other? And to me, that is a really hopeful way of looking at the human situation. Whereas if you're saying to me, well, there are these wounded people, but we're perfect, you can see this hierarchy emerging. And it's, yeah.
Yeah.
So to me, there's something very egalitarian about mutual woundedness. And to start there is, I think, a very powerful way of exploring these issues around race and prejudice and reparations. But again, this comes back to, have we got the tools as a religious society to articulate some of these very deep insights? Because early friends had this sense of mutual woundedness, that they were both wounded themselves, but they lived in a wounded world that they wanted
Mm.
to repair. And I think we need to recapture that, because that might actually move us away from sort of simplistic, journalistic ways of dealing with these issues towards a much more sensitive way of thinking about these problems.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, absolutely. And we know we've always let ourselves off the hook theologically, haven't we? I mean, we routinely tell each other, oh, well, we don't have much to say theologically. We don't talk about theology. And I would like to see much more of a if you like a teaching ministry, being developed. I would like to see more focus on difficult subjects like what you've just raised, and for that to be part of our culture rather than these firm political statements that we seem so clear about. So I'm wholeheartedly behind you there. Um, let's move into thinking about our hopes for the future then. Um, because we've talked a fair bit about the present and our worries about that and our criticisms, our critique of that. So what are your hopes or otherwise for the future? I mean, at the conference we were just told that there's about 10,000 of us left in Britain, and there's all this kind of, oh my gosh, isn't this terrible? We're disappearing. And I thought 10,000, that's amazing, that sounds like a lot of people to me.
Yeah.
Um, and the average age of Quakers in Britain is around 60. It's gradually gone up to about 61. But I mean, that doesn't surprise me. And I think for many people, they come to these big issues of their spiritual lives as they get into kind of middle age and older age. I think that's just normal. So I just don't, I'm not so worried about it. But given those kinds of contexts of where we are, what are your hopes for the future?
I suppose I want to kind of just go right down to the meeting level. I mean, my hope for the future is that we simplify, that we focus on what really matters in our meeting communities, I think. So a good example of that for me is in my meeting, there are so many committees, but multiple friends are on multiple committees. And we always have this problem about having enough people on committees. And then there was a recent hoo-ha about nominations committee, and we can't get enough people to serve on that, and so on. So we have these sort of argy-bargies that go around in circles about not enough people to do things. But my sort of question is, do we need all these committees really? So could we, if we thought that worship, and as worship is the most central part of our community, it's the life spring, why don't we just hold the committees that we can hold and lay down the ones that we can't run without becoming a burden or a source of resentment, and focus on being a community together, which
Mm.
might involve doing things in a much messier way because we have fewer committees, but we might have a more life-giving experience of being Quakers. Everything from just eating together, using the meeting house much more outside of the Sunday pattern, and really trying to bring ourselves together as a community rooted in our understanding of the Quaker way. And I
Yeah.
think that simplicity is what I'm kind of hoping that we do, that the demographics almost shift us to that.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I'm sure that you're not alone in thinking that simplicity is something we talk about a lot, and yet we just are not simple at all in what we do. I mean, I think it's crazy for us to have this simple, radical, and what's the other one on our.
Oh yes. Oh, it's gone. It's gone.
I've got the T-shirt somewhere.
Yes.
I mean, I don't think we're simple, and I don't think we're particularly radical. So I'm not. I think it's advertising that's not quite accurate. Um, so I think you're pushing at an open door there. I think there's a trend towards simplification, isn't there? And
Mm.
of laying down committees, um, and of using the meeting house more outside of Sunday mornings. I think it's great, but again, there seems to be little energy for that either. What do
Mm.
you think of the buildings situation? All of these buildings that we've got. Do you have any thoughts?
Again, yeah, that is going to cause, I think, over the next decade or two, a lot of understandable heartache, for those friends who have, a meeting infrastructure for whom that they're very used to that. So, but actually, I think there is a great freedom. This is controversial as someone who benefits from an actual physical building and wardens,
Yeah.
but there is freedom of saying, okay, we don't have to worry about the upkeep of a building. We can either rent somewhere that can be movable. We can have house meetings. I've been at house meetings before, and
Yeah.
they've been wonderful
Yeah.
because of the the human messiness of them,
Mm.
because they're in somebody's home. So you can't have this weird, reticence that you sort of maybe have in a meeting, which feels feels a bit more neutral. But if you're in somebody's home, there is that sort of implicit trust there, and
Yeah.
that messiness is really beautiful, and we should value that. So if some smaller Quaker communities have to sort of disinvest themselves of big buildings, that may not be the worst thing in the world. It may appear to be a blow, but maybe in the long run, it might actually be of great benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, well, I mean, I love house meetings. Yeah, I just wish there were more of them, really. I agree. It does require friends to have large enough homes to be able to accommodate, but you can have small groups. That's the point, you know.
Yeah,
It can be 6 to 8 people or whatever. Um, so yeah, I think that's great.
yeah, yeah.
What about our processes of organizing ourselves? Do you have any thoughts about area meetings and business meetings and
Again, it may be that if you end up with kind of smaller but more consistent numbers, and you disinvest yourself of a lot of the traditional infrastructure, that you may find that you have smaller business meetings, perhaps less frequently,
Hmm.
perhaps more frequent. So there are ways in which we can adapt. But
Yeah,
again, I sort of want to come back to this thing about why are we doing this? What is it about? Is it to fill committees or write minutes? Or is it to be rooted in a spirit shaped life? I mean, I think the kind of question that I always like to kind of pose is, well, a lot of the way Quakerism is often explained to outsiders, I think, is as a series of negatives. So we sort of say,
yeah,
well, we
yeah,
don't have liturgy, and we don't have
yeah.
priests, and we don't do this and don't do that. And then people are sort of none the wiser. I would like to kind of reframe it, really. So the way that I'll often sort of try to express it now is I'll say, 400 years ago, there are a group of people who started having some really strange experiences. They thought that Jesus of Nazareth was sort of together with them, and some of the stuff that happened in the Bible was happening to them in the 1640s. And we've spent 4 centuries trying to work out what this really means. Come in. That's what
Yeah,
it is.
yeah,
And it's a really, that is such a positive expression of we're on this like really weird journey. We don't know where it's going, but we trust that it's going somewhere. And it is rooted in that experience of being loved, being affirmed, being transformed. And that is just what an amazing invitation. Whereas if you just say, oh, meeting, we don't do this, we don't do that,
yeah.
I don't think it's a helpful way of, thinking about Quakerism at all.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because what you were just saying about 400 years ago, they were going through transformative experiences, whereas nowadays, do Quakers talk about, the ways in which today Quakers in Britain are experiencing those same things that people in the Bible are talking about? We really don't have those kinds of conversations very much at all, do we?
No, no. And again, it's probably a reticence, but I think, this has a direct impact on our structures because we can't really have a discussion about structures to retain unless we have a much clearer sense of what we're doing this all for anyway. So
Yeah,
I kind of always want to draw us back to this
yeah.
starting place because it will help us to know what to do.
But you see, to me, one of the things that we need to think about is how we privilege and give space to what you might call the bureaucrats or the managers amongst us,
Yeah.
compared with the ministers. And we've lost any sense of where is the leadership? Where do we get spiritual authority from? And of course, the people who are very comfortable within structures and bureaucracies are the bureaucrats and the managers. And we're very grateful for them. They sort out our accounts and all sorts. I mean, they're very helpful types of people to have with us. However, when you're talking about a spiritual community sharing deep truths, we've got to think about whose voices are we hearing more of? Are we hearing more from the managerial types who are talking about structures and talking about
Yeah, yeah.
ways in which we organize ourselves? Or are we listening to those still small voices who are very quietly doing a lot of prayer and quiet work and quiet discernment? And maybe now every now and then go, and nobody noticed it because everyone's over here talking loudly about some stuff.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're not giving space for the prophetic, are we? Really? I,
No.
I think we're very good at organizing things, and we have lots of very capable organizers. But it's like, to use this sort of language, we've got too many bishops and not enough prophets. So actually, we probably need to think about,
Yes.
again, what are we really doing this for? Now that might mean that we may do less as well,
Yes.
or we may feel we're doing less, which is maybe a different thing. But maybe that ability to be humble and to say, well, we can't do everything, and like we did try to do everything, but we actually can't do everything. So let's stop doing some things, definitely,
Yes.
and let's try to focus on what really is life giving. And that isn't the same as being quietist or being passive. It's more about saying, where can my energy, spiritually, emotionally, materially, be best used? And I think that's the question that we kind of keep on having to ask ourselves, because the more we ask it, we'll come up with some really interesting answers, I suspect.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ben, I mean, we've had such an interesting conversation. I think, is there anything else you want to add? Are there final thoughts that, I mean, we've pretty much had a lot of critique and hopes for the future and calls for bringing it back to the spiritual center. Um, is there anything else you'd like to
Mm,
add about the hopes
I,
for the future?
I suppose just to say that I feel bizarrely hopeful about the future. I think in precisely the same way that you've articulated, which is, it's very easy to worry about demographics and trends and so on, but like, why are we worrying about this when what we should worry about is being rooted, being faithful, you know, trusting, because people say, oh well, if present trends continue, well, present trends hardly ever continue. So I kind of feel like we're getting, we're getting wrapped up in anxiety,
Yeah.
and I think the anxiety is about being useful to the world or being impactful, again, which is about ego. I think it's about
Yeah.
us
Yeah.
again. It's not about the world. It's about how we feel about the world, how important we feel in it. Maybe we need to stop wanting to be important or being impactful or being useful. If there's a lovely image from a Chinese philosopher called Chuang-Tzu, and Chuang-Tzu says, the best kind of tree is a useless, like, gnarly tree that's really unattractive and you can't make a table out of it. Nobody's going to chop it down, which is excellent for the tree. So Chuang-Tzu recommends uselessness as a spiritual posture, because he says it's better for you than to be useful, and you'll kind of be chopped down by the awfulness of life. So we should be there for our deepest spiritual experiences and intuitions. And if that leads us into postures in the world and confrontation with the world and so on, so be it. But that's not why, we're almost you don't want to put the cart before the horse.
Mm.
So my hope comes from, I hope that people will rediscover that. And I hope our relative diminution in terms of organization may prompt us to think about the essentials, like the deep roots, Because maybe trying to kind of eject the idea of being respectable and being important and being useful, that might be the best thing that's ever happened to Quakerism
Yeah.
since Quakerism ever came into being. So that would be my sort of counterintuitive hope for the future, really.
That's great. Well, Ben, thank you so much for your time and your insights. I'm sure people will enjoy listening to this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Lovely to see you.